just some basic truths that elevate Christianity as are some things that make Christianity unique among religions. And so today we're going to take a little bit of a dive into the specifics of Christianity itself, because, well, like we've said over the last few weeks, every faith system cannot exist side by side. And so what makes Christianity the one that is the truth, the one that we should follow? What are some things that we would look to and say, okay, well, yeah, then that's the reason why Christianity rises above, because that's the one I want to follow, the faith system that actually rings true in the world that we live in, because I believe that God is going to operate within the confines most of the time of the world that he created. So he's not going to create a faith system that you and I follow that's going to be 100% illogical. Yes, miracles are a suspension of the rules of nature, but that by definition, they are that. And so if you have something that is by definition a suspension of the rules of nature, there have to be rules of nature that are rules. And so those rules that God has created, I believe, are things that we can look at to say, okay, we want to take this and apply it to our faith and see, does it hold up in the world around us? And that's why we've tried to build some concepts with regards to worldview information, so that we can have a good idea of how we should even approach these types of things. And so there really is one word that answers why Christianity is true, why it is superior, why it is the right faith system. And the word is one that we're very familiar with. It's not really just a word. It is the name. It is Jesus. When we look at Jesus, we come up with the reasons why Christianity is the faith system that does hold water. And I want you to be able not just to make statements like that, I want you to be able to dig into that a little bit. But also today, I want to introduce to you a little bit of how people will come at you and try to erode that, foundationally speaking, because the reality is Jesus is the most foundational figure in world history, certainly in Western culture. And over the last 2,000 years, you could not point to one person that has been as more influential than Jesus has been. You look all across the West and you see the fingerprints of the church, and therefore Jesus, whether it was the Catholic Church that was off base or any of that. You could obviously get very specific and nitpicky about those things, but Jesus, at the foundation of it all, lays the foundation, or is the foundational figure of Western culture. Why would that be? Because Jesus led no armies. He held no actual position. He died in a rather humiliating way. I mean, the crucifixion was a way to kill someone that was meant to shame them. So his death was a shameful death, and his followers initially scattered and left him alone. So he died alone, an infamous death, so to speak, at a young age, and yet he was an outsider even while he was on this earth, and yet he still is that influential. And so we have to ask questions, okay, why is that? But the reality is, what I have, as I have studied and come to have conversations with people, a lot of times what people will try to do is they'll try to avoid the issue entirely by questioning the truthfulness of the claims about Jesus at their base level. And so what I mean by that is, was Jesus even real? Because if you can erode someone's confidence in the reality of the existence of Jesus, well, then everything else does then crumble. And I told you last week, our founder is absolutely necessary. You do not have Christianity if you do not have Christ. You don't have the church without Jesus. And so if you get rid of Jesus, historically speaking, then you have gotten rid of the foundation. I mean, he calls himself the chief cornerstone. You have literally, the Bible calls him the chief cornerstone. So you get rid of him, you get rid of the thing upon which the entire structure rests. And so what people will do is they'll question the factual basis of Jesus himself. Was he real? Was he actually what is claimed of him? I mean, we take the Bible passages almost for granted. You read that Jesus did this, or Jesus walked on water, miracles. But Jesus was from Galilee. He was born in Bethlehem, and we take all of those claims at face value, which we should. But there are some people that do not. They say, "Well, no, he wasn't. That was made up. The disciples made that up, or the early church made that up." And we're going to get into some of those things a little bit more specifically. Probably not tonight. I want to introduce the concept to you tonight. But what people will ultimately are trying to do is they have tried to avoid the concept or the conclusions entirely by eliminating Jesus from the picture. And you can see that there'd be a problem with that. But we want to know, okay, how did that happen? What did that look like, so that we can have an argument, or we can have a defense, and even more than a defense, we can have a proactive way of discussing with someone. Okay, no, we know that this is true, and this is why. Because ultimately speaking, I believe that Christianity is if you really begin to study Christianity, besides the fact that the Holy Spirit works in your heart when you do that, I mean, God wants you to believe, and he made evidences so that you could come to faith and all of that. But as you study Christianity, what I believe is that as you look at the evidence, there is no faith out there that is grounded in evidence like Christianity is. And that also is true when it comes to the historical reliability of the fact that Jesus was who he said he was. And eventually we'll kind of hit it probably from a few different angles, but when we've talked about it before, you get to the thing that I think maybe Nick brought it up one time, I think Johnny brought it up one time, but if it was neither of them, and I'm forgetting, the trilemma, which that was popularized by C.S. Lewis, which basically says, Jesus, by his claims, was either a liar, he was a lunatic, or he was the Lord. Those are the only three viable conclusions that you can come to from the scriptural evidence that we have. The problem with jumping right to that is, what if all of the claims that we look at to draw that conclusion are not even true in and of themselves? If it was all just put together by someone to claim that so that they could create this structure, well then, what does it matter what the Bible says about Jesus, because he wasn't those things? So how do we know that there was a first century figure named Jesus who was born in Bethlehem, who lived 33 and a half years, and for 3.5 or so years he had an active ministry in which he taught thousands of people, where he had 12 disciples that followed him. He performed miracles, he was crucified, and he rose again from the dead 3 days later. How can we actually know that that is true? You might think tonight, I've never thought about that before. Let's have a show of hands. How many of you have never thought of that before? Anybody? Whether or not you would question the existence of Jesus wholesale. Anybody? You've never questioned. So you have thought of it. That's what I'm trying to get at. Am I asking that question simply? So if you came tonight and you were and you never had the idea that people would even question that Jesus existed, you've never heard that people question that, raise your hand. So you've heard that. That's what I'm gathering. Okay, so I know my question is my head's been a little bit foggy today, so I'm not even sure I'm making sense at all. So good. Well, that really, in reality, to me, that is good for me to hear, because sometimes I come up with these things and I think, well, hopefully I'm hitting the things that are actually things that are pertinent to them. So what I want to do over the next little while tonight, and then probably, well, not next week. Next week is Thanksgiving, as we talked about just a little while ago. So next week's midweek service is going to be a pie and praise night. And so everybody else gets to join us on the snack train because we get snacks every week, and but no one else does. And so we'll be out there with everybody else, and we'll have pumpkin pie and apple pie and praising the Lord. And so we won't be in here next week. The following week, I won't be in here. And if you're in the choir, I would ask that you not be in here either, because we're going to have a choir practice in the chapel. And so I won't be here for the next 2 weeks together with everybody. But we will have Bible study on December 3rd is when that one is. Troy Smith is going to come in. He's done a lot of study on geological evidence, and some even that's not, I think, in Hampton, so not too far away from here, where you can, where he's done a lot of study on the layers of the sediment deposits that prove the flood, and so he's done a lot of study on that, and he's got some information that he can teach, and so he's going to give a little bit of an intro of that content on the 3rd. So I'm going to get it recorded because I don't want to not hear that. And he'll come back a few times and kind of give us the whole scope of that, not in sequential order, because then we'll want to keep going forward. And so I do want you to be thinking as well, it's going to be Christmas time by the time we really get back together where I'm in here with you. So it'll be like the 10th or something of December. And so if you ever have had a question about Christmas related traditions, bring them, all right? Or send them to me. Like, do I believe in Santa Claus, right? If you have that question, then rest assured, I do, right? And so, but no, if you have questions about Christmas, I'll try to take some time about that. I mean, if you're sitting in this room tonight and you think, well, I don't celebrate Christmas and I want to know why you do, then ask the question. I'd be glad to answer it. And it's not something I would shy away from. And I wouldn't, if you don't celebrate Christmas, I certainly wouldn't criticize you for that approach. But that's something that we could take a little bit of time for in the Christmas season. So we're going to get started with this, and we'll try to get to the finishing of some of these thoughts before it gets too late on. And then when we get into the new year, we'll be able to dive into some new topics. But the first thing we want to do as we look at the answer to the question was Jesus real? Are the historical accounts reliable, factually speaking? And if that is true, then we want to be able to make a case for who Jesus really was, scripturally speaking, and we'll say some things about that eventually, but certainly not tonight. So the first thing we have to do is establish the importance of the actual Jesus. And so I've already told you this, so I'm just going to throw it up there. But the first thing is that Jesus is absolutely necessary. Here's a quote for you. The Christian religion, this is from William Lane Craig. If you've never read any of his material, he is phenomenal. It's sometimes a little bit deep, but very, very powerful stuff. He says, the Christian religion stands or falls with the person of Jesus Christ. And as I've told you the last couple weeks now, Judaism could survive without Moses, Buddhism without Buddha, Islam without Muhammad, but Christianity could not survive without Jesus Christ. And we've explained some of the reasons why he is necessary. And biblically speaking, the Bible even says that, right? We talked to you last week about that whole concept of Pascal's wager. If I live as a Christian and you don't, and it's true, and Christianity is true, and you've lived like it wasn't, then you're certainly in a lot of trouble. But if vice versa, and it wasn't true, then I had a good life and you had a good life, and we just go on with annihilation, I guess, or whatever you might happen to believe in that case. Well, the Bible actually says that if we live as Christians and Christ is not who he said he was, if he's not risen, then we are of all men most miserable. And so actually, the reality is that the Bible even says that the factual accounts about Jesus Christ are essential. If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and read what is said there, it makes a very, very, very clear case for the reality that we need Jesus. We need the stories about Jesus to be true if we're going to have Christianity. So I'm not going to belabor the point because I said quite a bit about that already. The Christian religion and Christianity and Jesus himself is distinctly different from all other world religions. And so we will talk about eventually the deity of Christ and how we can see what the Bible says about him to make some points about that. But I don't want to get bogged down in some of that stuff because I want to talk to you tonight about the quest, what I call the quest for the historical Jesus. Because the authenticity of Jesus himself is one thing that constantly gets brought up, called into question, and so it kind of goes in phases almost, where there'll be a little while where maybe modern scholarship isn't really necessarily attacking the authenticity of the claims of Christ, and then there'll be a season where he is. And we've talked about some of this stuff when we talked about where the fundamentalist movement came from, but there really was a period of time where the claims, biblically speaking, about Jesus came under very serious attack. And if you remember, I talked to you about the modernist movement a while back. If you were here, if you weren't here for it, the modernist movement was basically a movement in the scholarship world and in the philosophical world that denied the existence of anything supernatural. It was kind of a post-Enlightenment way of thinking, where, if it does not follow the way that the world works, that we have proven by our newfound scientific way of approaching the world during the Enlightenment, then it must not be true. And so, like, half of Jesus' life could not be true. And you get famous stories. How many of you have ever heard that about Thomas Jefferson's Bible, that he cut everything out that was of any kind supernatural? I mean, how many of you have ever heard of that? So that's where that concept kind of took popular root, where people tried to have a Bible without the supernatural, which it gets a lot shorter when you have that, because not only do you have to take out the miracles, you have to take out prophecies, because prophecies are supernatural in nature. You cannot tell the future without it being supernatural, because no one actually knows the future. You take out prophecies, take out miracles, take out things, obviously, then like the virgin birth and the different things that happened even in the Old Testament, not even just related to Jesus. And so this movement called into question the supernatural elements of the story of Christ. But there's a problem. If you begin to question a story that is so tightly woven together, and you remove as inauthentic large swaths of the material, somebody tell me what you're going to think about the rest of the material, about its trustworthiness. You're probably not going to trust it, right? Like, who knows what if that wasn't true then? What if that wasn't true then? Right? And so that was really what that led to. And so the first aspect of the quest for the historical Jesus, really in the three major phases that it went through, was quest number one was to find the actual Jesus without all of the myths, without all of the supernatural stuff. We want the real Jesus, not the one that's the theologically informed Jesus that was explained to us in the Bible. And so this concept of removing all those things led to a lot of different problems with people not really understanding, or not coming to probably a healthy place of the balance between faith and reason. Because there are some things that we don't understand. What's one thing that we don't understand about our faith? Somebody just throw one out there. The Trinity. It's the one that was on my mind. It's the one that we go to probably quicker than anything else. Like, I don't really understand the concept of the Trinity. Like, I can't understand. I can't understand how something can be three in one, co-equal, and all of those different things all at one time, right? Well, the problem became that people started to just get to a point of, well, I'm going to accept it regardless of the evidence. You can't. Now, there is something admirable about saying, well, it doesn't matter what, bless God, I'm going to be what I am, no matter what anybody ever tells me, right? You should have that to a certain extent about your determination to follow the truth of Christianity. But the concept really became that Christianity was just a blind leap in the dark. It's fideism. It's just like, I'm just jumping out there regardless of what anybody ever tells me. I'm going to believe it, period. was kind of one side of it. No reason was good. And as a matter of fact, there was a rejection. So you've got the one side of the first phase was, all right, nothing supernatural. But then you have the Christians who say, well, we're still going to believe, but reasons are bad. So we don't need reasons. And so the void became that people were not even having intelligent conversations at all about it, because like all of a sudden, like I don't need reasons because all logical reasoning, all evidence is a bad thing. That's an Enlightenment way of approaching it. The German rationalism and all those types of things. And so we came over here, not we, but a lot of Christians came over here and kind of created this anti-intellectual, like you don't need to think about anything. You just got to accept it, face value, no questions ever asked. And then you had everybody on this side, and there was such a gap between the ways that people approached it that you really couldn't even have a dialogue, because there was almost a rejection by definition of either position. And so that was what happened. And so the first quest for the historical Jesus really resulted in that separation being created. And then the second aspect of the quest for the historical Jesus was basically in the early 1900s and into about the 1950s, where people began to say, okay, if there is no supernatural, I started to say a little bit of this a minute ago, and I in my mind I had to backtrack. This is where there was really more of but Jesus had to be real. And we want to know, not just get rid of the supernatural, but we want to know, like, who is he really? Like, not what the church said about him, not what the disciples said about him, but the actual Jesus himself, so to speak, the real Jesus. And it really was a pseudo-intellectual approach to, a pseudo-historical approach to examining the Gospels for the narrative that they thought was going to be the narrative that actually told about Christ. But what the earmarks of this period of time in scholarship was that the gospel narratives were held to a standard that the rest of history was not held to. So if there was ever any, and I don't have the list of a lot of things right here before me, but if there was ever anything where the Gospels didn't check every box, they were just totally thrown out. Like, so they take every story and it had to have they meet all of these stringent, random, somewhat criteria for an historical account. And if it didn't match up, then it must not have been true. It must have been made up by somebody later. It must have been, come about by some myth that the church created in the medieval period or something like that. It certainly couldn't have dated all the way back. But the reality was that a lot of those claims, even if some of them were like, well, there was a little bit of there's no evidence that place even existed. And so they would throw out the story because there might be a lack of evidence for something, archaeologically speaking. And so they were like, well, that's not true because this isn't that way. But what the problem was later on, when archaeology, archaeology say, when you're digging up stuff from a long time ago, you're constantly finding new evidence about different things. And so what they would not often do would be correct past claims about, well, they ruled this passage out because, well, there was no place like that. But then what happens when they find it? And there was corroboration. And so what they did is it was just kind of like, well, if you get one thing wrong on the test, you fail the whole thing. Was kind of the way they approached it, as opposed to most historical evidence about anything. You've got to give it time to flesh it out. And so there's a lot of things that were done in that period of time. That's why I say it was kind of pseudo-historical. Like it took a way of approaching history and trying to prove whether or not something actually happened. And they they kind of made it look like they were trying to say, well, we really want to know who Jesus actually was. And so we've come up with this really long list of criteria that most other historical events probably wouldn't even check off, like whether or not Julius Caesar did this particular thing, probably wouldn't check all those boxes off either. And but they applied it to the Gospels and applied it to the rest of history. And so, and I know some of this is probably a little bit more technical than you want to hear, but then the last phase of the quest for the historical Jesus is kind of an interesting one. It was led by Jews, and there was a period of time where there was a lot of Jewish rabbis and scholars that obviously the stories of Jesus have been around for 2,000 years. There's a lot of angst between the Judaism and Christianity because, well, one problem that Judaism has with us is that we tell them that they killed the Messiah. And they don't really like to hear that because they're still waiting for the Messiah. And if they're going to get to a point of faith, they've got to accept what was done at that particular point and all of that. But there was a school of rabbis that decided, you know what, Jesus was a real figure, and because of some of the evidence that they kind of accepted as a presupposition, but they wanted to almost prove what Jesus would have been like as a Jew. So they were really rediscovering and reclaiming the Jewish nature of Jesus the Messiah, which ultimately led to a repopularization of the figure of Jesus, and in a unique way, but also set him in his context. And so it's actually a uniquely good one, even though it was led by people that were not necessarily trying to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, but they just wanted to study the figure Jesus in his Jewish context. And so and that really, those are three of the major phases that went on in the last couple of hundred years that have muddied the waters, some good things, some bad things, to say, okay, well then who is Jesus? Like, was he a real person? And you say, well, you really haven't answered that question yet either. And that really wasn't the point of this particular aspect. What I really want you to do is I want you to understand what has been done, and in a light summary sense, to try to make a case for or detract from and the idea of Jesus as a person. So along the way, there have been several arguments that have come up that would be arguments against the historical Jesus in the midst of these quests. And so I want to give you just a little bit of an understanding of some of these things, and we'll stop here in about 5 minutes. And if you have questions, if there's clarification that I could add, then please let me know, and we'll try to do that. And the first couple are right here. So first, that the disciples made him up. And the second one's obviously very similar to it, but not necessarily the same. This first one is Jesus did not exist. That this group of people in the first century just created the Jesus figure, the story of his birth, and all the rest. It was purely a work of fiction. Is the concept that people, because we obviously have the stories, and they have been around for a long time. And we've got old records, biblically speaking, that we can go a long way back. And so these stories have been in existence. So if you're going to try to say, but Jesus wasn't real, because the supernatural aspects, one thing that people say, well, that's because the disciples made him up and they spread the stories. Or another really aspect of that would be that the church made him up later on. That there was this entity, this organization that got together, and not even in the first century, but multiple centuries later, and they came up with the stories. And so I want to take those and look at them kind of in separate ways here over the next couple of minutes to try to say, okay, how do we know that's, or what would be some responses that we could have to that concept to say that's probably not the case? Well, one, and I've told you this before, an alternate theory for the evidence does not make it true. Just because you say, well, yeah, we have stories about Jesus, but that's because people made those stories up. You have to be able to prove that. How can you prove, if somebody ever says that to you, ask them for reasons, why do you believe that people made the stories up? Most people don't have reasons for what they believe, even when they disagree with you. They just heard something that clicked with their mind, and they're just like, well, I don't know. Because what evidence could you cite to say, that people made up the story of Jesus? Well, what evidence could you cite that they didn't? Well, for one, the records are authentic writing. There are authentic writings within the New Testament that date all the way back to the period of time where eyewitnesses or the people that were influenced by eyewitnesses would have been alive. And they did not contradict the stories. We talked about the resurrection months and months ago, and we're not going to delve back into that stuff, so to speak. But the writings of the New Testament, we can trace the biblical record of the history of the Bible itself all the way back. And the stories remain unchanged. And there's something that would be said if the stories were not true. And we'll talk about the historical authenticity, the reliability of the texts at some point along the way, because we're going to talk about one of these days, we'll get into Bible versions, and obviously we use the King James Version here, and we'll talk about those things because that's what this Bible study is for. And so we'll get into some of those things, but along the way. But the text itself says what it has said longer than some people say the myth has existed. So that would kind of rule out they made it up in the 200s. When you can look at a translation of the Bible from the mid 100s and it talks about Jesus. Well, why were they talking about him in 130 AD if they didn't make him up until 250? So there's that. Another thing is, if you do say that the disciples made up Jesus, you have to be able to explain how a random group of people, aka fishermen, unlearned, ignorant men, as they were described in the New Testament, how they pulled the wool over the entire world's eyes. These were not intelligent people. I like Peter. John, he's a great guy. But to fool the world, you've got to be a pretty smooth talking guy. And we all know, and I know I'm citing biblical, just to be tongue-in-cheek, biblical stories, but we all know he wasn't really that. And even if he was, to come up with a lie that everybody in that day begins to believe or just removed, people would have very, very strong reasons to question whether or not Jesus existed in the 90s when the Romans were killing them because of their faith in Christ. Because we know that happened. So they would probably want to ask John, so what was Jesus like? And John, under pressure, is always going to sell the story every time, and every other disciple that was martyred for their faith. No one cracked. Ever? Those are the things that you have to answer. Okay, the story, the idea that the disciples made Jesus up has to be able to explain the evidence, or explain those things as well. You have to, does that actually hold up underneath the idea that we know the disciples, from what we know of them historically speaking, they were not educated people, and yet they would have had to come up with a lie that would have fooled the entire world. They cite eyewitnesses. So the eyewitnesses could have been verified. You go and check. 500 people at one time saw Jesus after his resurrection. There were other people that saw Jesus' miracles that did not believe him. The Sadducees, and the Pharisees, they killed him. And so there would have been a great movement to say, these guys are claiming that this happened. And, well, it didn't happen because there was no Jesus. Or they made the stories, they embellished the stories So yeah, Jesus did exist, but he's still dead. Well, we talked about that with the resurrection. They could just go and show him the grave, and if they stole the body, then you have to be able to explain how the disciples overcame a Roman guard, the most elite soldiers of their day, and so there's a lot of problems that you have to begin to answer if you're going to make the case that, historically speaking, the disciples either made Jesus up, had to fool the whole world, they embellished the records that didn't really happen to the extent. I mean, yeah, Jesus was a real man, but they just kind of took a real figure and then they just made up all these stories and attached him to this real fisherman guy or carpenter that lived in the first century. And so those would be some things that go into the idea that you could say, well, yeah, Jesus was, that when people say, well, he wasn't real because of this, because we think the disciples made Jesus up or whatever. So I'm not going to get into any of the next ones. We're going to pause and see if there's anything that I could answer question-wise that I caused a question maybe tonight for clarification, or there's something else on your mind, or you've got something you'd like to add. And if not, then we'll wrap up and we'll actually finish at like 8 o'clock tonight. So
one thing is about pulling the wool over Peter and John, and them pulling the wool over the eyes of people. That they would have to pull the wool over the eyes of Paul.
Yeah,
he was one of the most learned of the Pharisees.
Yeah, so a great point. Paul was converted later, after the resurrection. So yeah, good point. Very good. What else? Anything else? Anybody have a totally unrelated question that they've just been itching to ask? I know it's sometimes hard to get your mind off of this track, but that's also what this question times are for. So you can change the whole subject. If you didn't like the subject tonight, here's your chance to change it. So, well, that was easy.
Why are you just so awesome?
You don't have enough time. Becca can answer that for you later. So, yeah, very good. All right. Well, please do keep your thinking caps on. I try to come here with pertinent information, and by the time we get back together, it'll be, like I said, Christmas time, and so I will welcome your Christmas themed questions. We will have kind of a one night that we're together in December, and there won't be too many before it's Christmas Eve and all of that. And so, but we'll have a little bit more of a Christmas. It won't be a Christmas party per se, but it kind of will be. We'll have some more games that we play Christmas wise, and so that might be the week that I tell you to bring your Christmas questions. And so, wonder why we have Christmas trees? Are the Christmas trees in the Bible? And is it a bad thing to put lights on a tree and all? If you ever wonder if Christmas trees are in the Bible, Google it later and so find out what is there that some people will criticize. So there's all kinds of great traditions around Christmas that we could wonder why do we do Christmas? Yeah. Anyway, so and if you have no questions, we just have a really long party, then that's great too. So, but thank you for being here tonight. I appreciate it. Thanks for listening to me as we try to tackle some. I think sometimes harder sometimes even just to wrap our minds around at things, but you are dismissed for tonight. There's still ice creamy things back there, softer than they were when we started, but
It's on the eat, because that one that you gave me was
a little fishy.